Hi, this is David Bedford with Bright Moon Liverpool. Welcome back to another video. And again, we're looking at the role of the Beatles drummers. Now, I've had a lot of feedback on the videos on why Pete Best was got rid of, even though we weren't actually tackling that as a subject. What I would always say is don't judge Pete Best just on the 6th of June. For the same reason, don't judge Ringo Starr just for the 4th of September. That was the first date that he went down to EMI Studios to meet George Martin. Now, with the history, part of the problem being caused because George Martin often is confused and conflated both the 4th of September and the 11th of September. But overall, his opinion, it does matter. Now, on the 4th of September, with Ringo, he was there, really, George Martin, to see how they got on over the summer with working on How Do You Do It? And of course, there is a version of that on Anthology. And how they got on with Love Me Do, he'd made some suggestions on that. It was not to make a record. It was just to catch up, see where they were up to. Now, they went through many versions of Love Me Do. And once George Martin had produced an acetate, he listened to it and he thought, no, that's not what I'm after. He was going to stick with his original decision from June, which was, if we make a record, I'm going to bring in a session drummer. Now, George Martin then, when he's looking at this moment, this is what he said. On the 11th of September 1962, we finally got together to make their first record. The boys, meantime, had brought along a guy, and they said, we're going to get Ringo to play with us. I said, we just spent good money and booked the best drummer in London. I'm not having your bloke in. I'll find out about him later. And of course, poor Ringo was mortified and I felt sorry for him, so I gave him the maracas. Also in Anthology, Martin said, when Ringo came to the session for the first time, nobody told me he was coming. I'd already booked Andy White and told Brian Epstein this. Now with the second session, George Martin didn't actually attend it. Like he did in June, he delegated that part to Ron Richards, who was the producer. Now Ringo naturally was shocked. Ringo later observed, I went down to play. He didn't like me either, so he called a drummer named Andy White, a professional session man, to play. I mean, obviously, it was devastating for Ringo. He thought he'd only just joined the Beatles, and that was, as he said later, they were doing a Pete Best on me. Maybe I was only good enough to play in the halls and the clubs, not on the record. I was absolutely devastated. One of the things you do have to wonder is why, once George Martin had told Brian Epstein during that week that he was booking a session drummer, why did John, Paul and George not actually tell Ringo this? Because as we know, when Ringo walked into the session, suddenly he thought, hang on, there's another drummer here setting up. Now, I asked about how this had happened. You know, some people have said Andy White was brought in to replace Pete Best. He wasn't. That decision was taken after the 4th of September session. I interviewed Andy White, the session drummer, who came in to play on that first record. And he said, I received a call a few days before the session from a fixer at EMI. Every record company had a guy who would contact the session musicians and book them for a particular gig. I received a call from EMI. It was only when he walked in on the morning of the 11th of September, I realised it was Ron Richards producing the session. Now, Ron Richards, in later interviews, has said he put Pete Best through his paces on the 6th of June, and he'd asked Pete to do certain things, and Pete couldn't do that. Though he said it was unlikely that Ringo could have done it as well. Because what Ron Richards was a stickler for drumming in the studio. He was the guy who was advising George Martin, who was saying, I want to bring in a session drummer. And it makes a lot of sense to do that because they're quick, they're professional, they know the studio, and they can do the job really fast. Ringo, of course, was devastated, but he's told to go and sit in the control room. Andy White sets his drums up, and Andy told me that as with any session, I'd known what I was going to be doing that day. I sat down and discussed the songs with John and Paul most of the time because they were the songwriters. Of course, they had no written music. As we know, they couldn't read or write music, but that was fine. They knew what they wanted, so I was impressed with them. I thought it was a nice change to work on original songs. We worked through the routines and started rehearsing. So Andy White was quite happy with what he was doing. He got some good banter going with John and Paul, could understand what they were wanting from the song. So very quickly, the three Beatles and Andy White get together and they start working on the song. Ringo, of course, is sat up in the control room looking very dejected. At one point he was offered to come down and play maracas. That didn't pacify him either. But they start getting on with making Love Me Do. So let's now look at the recording session. Now this is why you get session musicians in. The actual recording session was booked from 4:45 p.m. till 6:30 p.m. Not a lot of time. But in that time, with Andy White on drums, they recorded Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, and a couple of takes of Please Please Me, which they've been working on. You can suddenly see, in that short space of time, they made 3 recordings, all of which were capable of being released as records. Whereas they spent almost the whole day on the 4th of September just running through mainly How Do I Do It and Love Me Do. Now Jeff Emmerich remembers, and this probably is the important thing with the session musicians, White seemed to get the hang of it. I was amazed at how quickly he did so and how well he fit in with these unfamiliar musicians. That is the mark of a great session player. So that's why we know Andy White was called in. Now they want to do some more versions of Love Me Do during that session. So Ron Richards called Ringo down. Maybe he was getting his hopes up, but Richards said, no, what I'd like you to do is to play tambourine next to Andy White, which obviously didn't help. So what is the difference between Ringo's version and Andy White's version? Now, as we know, it was Ringo's version that was released initially for the single in the UK, and we'll look at that in a future video. But what is the difference between the two? Well, funnily enough, one of the things that really makes it stand out is the version with Andy White playing drums. You can hear the tambourine. And one of those skills that Ringo brought to the Beatles was percussion. It actually livens up, which is, I think it's not the most exciting of Beatles songs. It's quite dull at times. John's harmonica obviously lifts it, but Ringo's tambourine actually makes it stand out. Now there's an author, Anthony Roberstelli, who I've got to know, and he wrote a book, I Want to Tell You, and he's looking at the Beatles recording sessions, and he's examined the 2 versions. So this is his feedback. The second version of Love Me Do with Andy White is 5 beats per minute faster and therefore rocks a little harder. The recording is far superior sonically to the other version, with the kick and snare punchy in the mix. Furthermore, Andy White's kick drum pattern is much busier, and though it seems to lock in with the bass much better, it was a different style, but it works. In some ways it's difficult, he said, to compare the feel of the kick drum because of the sonic differences between the 2 versions. Because on Ringo's version from the 4th of September, the kick drum is barely audible. You can't really pick it up that much. Whereas with Andy White, it's much more punchier. You can really make it stand out. This, along with Ringo's tambourine, does make it a brighter and much livelier version. Which is why, obviously, in future releases, and including the album, it's Andy White's version that was released, not Ringo's. So George Martin, obviously, has commented on the whole recording session, what happened with Love Me Do. And this was George Martin's feedback. It was, Ringo always got a unique sound out of his drums, a sound as distinctive as his voice. Ringo gets a looser, deeper sound out of his drums that is unique. This detailed attention to the tone of his drums is one of the reasons for Ringo's brilliance. Although Ringo does not keep time with the metronome accuracy, he has an unrivaled feel for a song. If his timing fluctuates, it invariably does so in the right place at the right time. He keeps the right atmosphere going on the track and giving it a rock-solid foundation. This held true for every single Beatles number that Ringo played on. He was also a great tom-tom player. So as I said at the beginning, we don't judge Ringo just on the one performance on the 4th of September. Just as we don't judge Pete Best just on the 6th of June. But Ringo's skills, as picked up by George Martin there, even if his timing wasn't perfect, and Paul McCartney said at that stage his timing wasn't perfect, he was the live drummer, wasn't he? That improved, but his unusual ability to get the feel of the song and get the right rhythm and play the right drum fill or leave it silent, and the right snare, that combination of that swishing hi-hat, that marked Ringo out as a very, very unique drummer. And as we know, look at the recording career he had with the Beatles. He was an exceptional drummer. And, okay, it was a bit of a false start, and he thought they were doing the Pete Best on him. But after that, George Martin grew to trust on Ringo in the recording studio. Look what he did in the future. Now, if you want to know any more and go into more depth on what happened here, this is all in the book that I wrote with Gary Popper called Finding the Fourth Beatle. If you're interested in that, you can get it via the link in our store down below. Hope you've enjoyed this. Don't forget to leave comments. Always happy to get into a debate to discuss anything to do with Beatles history. And obviously, these very key moments in early Beatles history determined what happened for their recording career and for those next few years. See you next time.